Everybody thinks they know Rome, the shining marble, the roaring crowds, the heroes in armor. But the truth was never that clean. In AD 166, the empire was not a city of glory. It was a dying beast choking on its own blood. Smoke hung over empty streets. The sound of mourning drifted through the markets. Half the population was gone, taken by a plague no god could stop. The legions that once crushed nations now struggled to bury their own dead. And while Rome coughed out its last strength, something vast was moving beyond the northern rivers, a tide of warriors, families, and tribes, not coming to steal, but to replace. They were not the enemy of Rome's walls. They were the future waiting to erase them. What followed would decide if civilization could survive its own rot. It would give birth to a kind of commander the world had never seen, a man who saw war as arithmetic and mercy as weakness. His name was Marcus Nonius Macrinus, and he was about to turn the empire's dying heart into a weapon. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The first sign of the end was a cough. Nobody took it seriously. It began in the ports, carried by sailors returning from the east. Within weeks, it was everywhere, in the crowded alleys, the temples, the homes of senators and slaves alike. The Antonine Plague didn't care about rank. It burned through the empire like slow fire under the skin. By midsummer, the smell of rot hung over whole neighborhoods. Markets were silent except for the creak of wagons filled with bodies. Priests prayed in the streets until they collapsed. Rome, the center of the world, had become a city of ghosts. In the provinces, farms lay empty. Grain fields turned to dust because no one was left to harvest them. The tax collectors stopped coming, there was nothing left to take. Across the northern border, the Danube frontier, once guarded by stone forts and iron discipline, now stood half empty. The soldiers were sick, starving, or gone. And far beyond that frozen river, people were watching. They were not raiders this time, not a few hundred horsemen looking for loot. This was something else. Villages, tribes, whole nations were on the move. They had buried their dead, packed their wagons, and turned south. Nearly 200,000 of them. The Romans called them barbarians. But they were families, warriors, kings, people who had lived too long under Roman taxes and Roman threats. Now they saw the empire wounded and bleeding. They saw their chance. When the first scouts crossed the river and looked upon the abandoned forts, they could hardly believe it. The gates were open. The fires were cold. The empire that had terrified their grandfathers was empty. The migration began like a storm. Forts fell without a fight. Roads once built for legions became highways for the invaders. News reached Rome weeks too late. Couriers arrived with messages written in shaking hands. The Danube line is broken. Entire legions are gone. In the imperial palace, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, stared at maps that no longer made sense. Every border was bleeding. Every answer he wrote in his private meditations was swallowed by a single truth. The empire could not survive both plague and invasion. Rome needed not a thinker. It needed a mind made of iron. And somewhere in northern Italy, one man was already sharpening that mind. He was rich, refined, and merciless. His name would soon make even other generals look away in silence: McCrinus. Marcus Nonius Macrinus did not look like a savior. He looked like a senator, clean robes, calm voice, polished hands that had never swung a sword. But behind those eyes was a mind that could cut deeper than any blade. He had been raised in wealth. Tutors taught him poetry and philosophy, but numbers were what held his attention. Grain shipments, weapon counts, soldier rations. While others dreamed of honor, he studied efficiency. He saw that every victory in history began not with bravery, but with logistics. When the empire began to crumble, Marcus Aurelius knew there was no time left for speeches. The old generals, with their noble reputations, were useless. They gave stirring words to troops who had no boots, no food, no will. So, the emperor sent for Macrinus, the cold aristocrat who never flinched from ugly truths. When Macrinus arrived at the northern front, he found not an army, but a graveyard pretending to be one. Tents sagged under snow and filth. Sick soldiers lay coughing in their own blood. Horses were dying faster than men could bury them. The air stank of waste and despair. And yet, the officers lived well. Their tents were warm. Wine poured into silver cups. Reports sent to Rome were full of lies, claiming victories, discipline, and control that no longer existed. They blamed everything on the plague. Macrinus walked among them in silence, his face unreadable. He said nothing for days, only watched, only counted. He studied the food stores, the latrines, the sleeping quarters. He compared the written reports with what his eyes told him. Nothing matched. Then, one morning, he summoned everyone, every officer, every soldier, every servant. Thousands gathered in the cold air, expecting a speech. Maybe comfort. Maybe hope. They received neither. Macrinus stood before them and began to read names. Each name belonged to an officer who had lied, stolen, or abandoned his post. One by one, they were dragged forward. Some he stripped of rank. Others he executed on the spot. No shouting. No drama. Just clean, efficient judgment. The army stood frozen. Fear moved through the ranks like frost through grass. They had never seen anything like it. Then Macrinus spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, steady, and final. This is the cost of survival. From this moment, only results matter. That day, Rome's broken army began to change. They no longer served a country. They served a machine, one built by a man who had killed mercy to keep civilization alive. After the executions, silence ruled the camp. No one dared speak unless ordered to. Every man understood that the old days were gone. Rome's army had been cleansed in blood, and Macrinus was rebuilding it from ashes. He started with the simplest things. He walked through the camp counting supplies by hand, sacks of grain, barrels of water, crates of weapons. He marked what could be used and burned what couldn't. He ordered carpenters to build new latrines far from the river so the plague would stop spreading. He assigned clean water guards, soldiers whose only duty was to keep it pure. Discipline, he said, is not bravery. It's mathematics. Within weeks, men stopped dying of sickness. They still feared their commander, but now they feared disease less. They began to march again. Macrinus gave them boots. He brought in leather workers from nearby towns and had every soldier fitted properly. The men had been limping for months, their feet torn open. Now they could walk. And a soldier who can walk is a soldier who can fight. Then came the training. There were no grand speeches, no banners, no songs. Only drills, endless, brutal drills. Macrinus watched from dawn till night, measuring how long each formation took to move, how many heartbeats it took to reload a crossbow, how many steps before exhaustion showed on a man's face. Those who failed were punished. Those who excelled were rewarded, extra bread, better weapons, small signs that effort mattered again. But Macrinus was not only rebuilding bodies. He was rebuilding fear, turning it into fire. He brought refugees from the north into the camp, their clothes still stained with smoke. He ordered them to tell their stories, of burned homes, murdered families, villages erased. He made his soldiers listen. No one looked away. When they found ruins of destroyed towns, he took his men there. He made them see the bodies, smell the ash. And when they stood in silence, he said only one thing: "This is what reaches your families if you fail." That night, no man slept easily. Slowly, the army began to change shape. They no longer waited for orders from Rome. They waited for Macrinus. He was not their inspiration. He was their fear, their compass, and their weapon. The empire had given him absolute power. He used it to build something colder than loyalty, obedience. By the time winter broke, the north was falling apart. Tribes had crossed the Danube in waves. Villages burned. Refugees fled south, bringing fear with them. The Senate begged Marcus Aurelius for action, but the emperor had no armies left strong enough to send, except the one now ruled by Macrinus. When Macrinus studied the maps, he saw the truth that others refused to face. The frontier was lost. Trying to hold it would kill what little remained of Rome's strength. So he made a decision that seemed like madness. He would retreat, not in panic, but in design. At the war council, his generals stared at him in disbelief. "Abandon the border," one shouted. "You'll hand the empire to them." Macrinus didn't argue. He traced a slow line on the map with his finger. "We won't hand them anything. We'll let them take what's already dying and choke on it." He called it a retreat. But it was really a trap drawn on the scale of a nation. Orders spread like wildfire. Villages along the Danube were emptied. Civilians were moved south under guard. Every bridge behind them was destroyed. Every storehouse emptied or burned. Wells were poisoned with lime and carcasses. Grain soaked in salt. Orchards cut down to the roots. Rome was setting its own land on fire. The soldiers wept as they burned their homes, but Macrinus gave no comfort. He told them, "Better ashes than enemy bread." When the tribes reached the frontier, they thought they had already won. The forts were silent. The gates stood open. They cheered as they crossed, believing the gods had given them Rome's heart. But the land they entered was dead. Every road led to emptiness. Every stream stank of death. Their children cried from thirst. Their old men collapsed by the roadside. And still, they marched south, deeper into the empire's skeleton. From the forests and hills, Roman scouts watched it all, counting every wagon, every fire. Macrinus had turned the empire itself into a weapon, a desert of starvation. Behind them, his soldiers whispered that their commander had gone mad. They were wrong. He was building a coffin, and the enemy was walking into it. Weeks passed, and the tribes kept moving south. They no longer marched like conquerors. They dragged themselves forward, hungry, sick, half-frozen. Behind them lay a trail of corpses and broken wagons. But ahead, they believed, waited salvation, the rich lands of Italy. They only had to push a little further. They had no idea that the man they were chasing was watching every step. From the cover of the forests, Macrinus studied their movements like a hunter marking a wounded beast. He knew exactly when to strike, and where to make them bleed. He chose a night when the moon was weak. 3,000 of his finest soldiers, stripped of all weight, moved through marsh and forest in silence. No fires. No voices. Mud sucked at their boots as they waded waist-deep through frozen swamps. By dawn, they were deep behind enemy lines, at the rear of the Great Migration. Ahead of them stretched a sea of wagons, tents, and sleeping families. The heart of the enemy's lifeline. Macrinus raised his hand, and 3,000 shadows moved as one. The attack came like the breaking of a nightmare. War horns shattered the dark. Flaming arrows turned night into fire. Roman soldiers burst from the trees screaming in Latin and tribal tongues, their torches cutting through the chaos. Wagons burned. Animals panicked and trampled the fleeing. Children cried as tents collapsed in smoke. No formation could hold. It wasn't a battle. It was an eruption. Macrinus had ordered his men to leave paths of escape, corridors where survivors could flee. He wanted witnesses. He wanted fear to travel faster than his legions ever could. By sunrise, the camp was ash and silence. The Romans vanished back into the forests as if the earth had swallowed them. When the survivors reached their leaders, trembling and filthy, they spoke of ghosts, soldiers that appeared from the mist, burned everything, and disappeared. The enemy's songs stopped. The laughter stopped. Now every shadow whispered of Rome's revenge. Macrinus had discovered the perfect weapon, not swords or fire, but dread. From that night onward, the tribes marched without sleep, haunted by an enemy they could never find. And Macrinus, silent and patient, watched them crumble from within. The coffin was closing. He was almost ready to seal it. The morning air was grey and bitter. The sun barely lifted over the hills, casting thin shadows over frozen mud. Macrinus watched from his hilltop perch as the tribal host moved forward, hundreds of thousands, pressed together like cattle in winter. They thought they were charging toward victory. They thought they could overwhelm the city and take Italy. They had no idea that the trap had already been set. For months, Roman engineers had prepared the battlefield. Ditches, sharpened stakes, hidden artillery, and carefully chosen elevations had turned open fields into a maze of death. The northern advance had been bait, a lure to draw them where the Romans wanted them. The first wave of warriors hit the stakes. Screams ripped through the freezing air. Men fell into the hidden ditches, impaled on sharpened spikes. The soldiers behind pushed forward blindly, pressing their friends into death. Every step forward was agony. Every breath was soaked in smoke, blood, and mud. Roman arrows flew like storms of iron. Artillery bolts cut through shields and bodies alike, sending men sprawling into the frozen ground. Macrinus did not move. He did not need to. The trap worked itself. Hours passed. The initial energy of the tribes faded into exhaustion. Their formation fractured. Chaos replaced discipline. Then, like the closing jaws of a bear trap, the hidden Roman cavalry struck. Thousands of riders thundered down the hillsides, lances piercing flanks and backs of those who thought themselves safe. At the same time, hidden infantry emerged near the river crossings behind them. Escape routes vanished. The massive host of nearly 200,000 people was suddenly compressed into a shrinking, suffocating cage of steel, mud, and terror. Panic spread. Tribal standards wavered and fell. Leaders were cut down or trapped. Men trampled women. Families were crushed under the weight of their own desperation. The Romans pressed forward slowly, step by step, measuring every move. Every inch gained pushed the enemy deeper into annihilation. Macrinus' plan was not about heroics. It was about numbers, patience, and control. By evening, organized resistance had ended. The ground was buried under thousands of corpses. Rivers ran thick with blood and mud. Wagons, weapons, and shields were broken and abandoned. Ballomar was gone, lost in the chaos. The tribes that had threatened the heart of the empire were shattered, hunted, and scattered. Macrinus did not celebrate. He gave orders to gather survivors, bury the dead, and salvage what could be used. There was no triumph in the carnage. Only discipline, calculation, and the cold truth that Rome survived because one man had been willing to use death as a tool. By the time Marcus Aurelius arrived weeks later, the northern frontier had been secured. The surviving tribes submitted, hostages were taken, and the empire breathed again. History would remember the philosopher king. Stories of gladiators and heroism would endure in the minds of generations. But the truth, the terrifying, necessary truth, of how Italy had been saved, of how hundreds of thousands had been crushed in the cage outside Aqualia, remained almost entirely forgotten. Macrinus had saved the empire, but at a cost that no statue, no poem, and no legend could ever properly tell. The field of death became a silent warning. Power could be defended not only with courage or honor, but with cold, precise calculation. And sometimes, that was all that stood between civilization and collapse. Rome endured. Because one man had understood what everyone else could not, survival demanded more than bravery. It demanded the ruthless will to do what had to be done. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.